The morning Alice Grayson walked into Harlan's general store with her mother's ring pinched between two trembling fingers was the morning she swore to herself that she would not cry, not in front of anyone, and certainly not in front of old Harlan Briggs, who had a mouth wider than the Rio Grande and a tendency to share everything he heard with everyone he met. It was the spring of 1882, and the town of Dust Creek, Texas, sat baking under a sun that had already forgotten how to be gentle. The town wasn't much to look at: a main street of weathered storefronts, a saloon that doubled as a courthouse on particularly lawless Mondays, a livery stable that smelled precisely as one would expect, and a post office that received mail 3 times a week if the stage wasn't robbed. But to Alice, Dust Creek was the town nearest to the only thing she had left in the world, which was the 320 acres her husband Thomas had died trying to build into something worth passing down. Thomas had been gone 14 months now. A fever took him in February of the previous year, the kind that swept through the valley quietly, without warning, stealing men who had survived droughts and cattle drives and cattle thieves without a scratch. He had been 31 years old and full of plans, and Alice had loved him the way people love things that they believe will last forever. She had not been prepared for forever to end so soon. She was 26 now, and the land was still hers, legally, which was the one small mercy that the law had seen fit to extend to widows in Texas. But law and survival were 2 different things, and the tax notice she had received from the county assessor 3 weeks ago made very clear that if she could not produce $47 by the end of May, the county would begin proceedings to reclaim the property for unpaid debt. $47 might as well have been $470. She had worked the land herself through the winter, hiring a neighboring boy named Pete Dawson for small wages to help with the heavier lifting. But the cattle she had managed to keep numbered only 8 after a particularly brutal bout of sickness had torn through her small herd in November. 8 cattle did not produce $47 without selling most of them, and selling most of them meant she would have nothing left to work with come the following season. Her mother's ring had been sitting in the cedar box on the mantel since Alice could remember. Her mother, Eleanor, had worn it every day of her married life, a simple gold band set with a single oval garnet the color of dark wine. Eleanor had pressed it into Alice's hands the day Alice married Thomas, saying that she was too old to need such things, and that Alice was beginning the life that ring had always belonged to. Alice had kept it in that cedar box because she had always thought of it as a beginning, as something that marked the starting point of everything good, and she had not been able to bring herself to wear it after Thomas died. Now she stood at Harlan's counter with the ring in her palm and her pride in her throat. Harlan Briggs looked at it with the practiced indifference of a man who had seen desperate people before and had learned to keep a neutral expression as a professional courtesy. "I'd say $4, he said. Alice looked at him steadily. "It's solid gold and a real garnet." "$4.50, Harlan said. "Harlan, I need $12 for this ring." He picked it up, turned it toward the window, set it back down. "$8, he said. "And that's generous, Alice, and you know I mean it kindly. $8 would not pay the full tax. $8 would not even pay half. But $8 was more than nothing, and she could feel the tears trying to find the backs of her eyes, and she was not going to let them, not here. "I'll think on it," she said, which was what a person said in Dust Creek when they were about to go and cry somewhere private and then come back and accept the offer. She turned to leave, and that was when the door opened. He was not particularly remarkable at first glance. Tall, yes, and broad through the shoulders the way working men were, with a dusty gray coat and a hat that had seen considerable weather. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that carried 2 days of stubble and eyes that were an unsettling shade of brown, the kind that looked lighter in certain angles of light, almost amber, almost gold. He stepped aside to let her pass, touching the brim of his hat in the automatic courtesy of a man who had been raised to be polite, and she walked past him without a second thought, because her mind was entirely occupied with $47 and the fact that May was not very far away. She went home, unhitched the wagon horse named Clover from the post outside, and drove the 6 miles back to the Grayson property in a silence that felt heavier than the open sky above her. The land looked good, which was almost cruel. The spring grass had come up thick and green along the creek bank, and the cottonwood trees that Thomas had planted along the south fence were actually growing with something like ambition. The house itself was solid, built from local cedar and limestone, 2 rooms and a kitchen and a sleeping loft, not grand by any measure but tight against the wind and honest in its proportions. Thomas had built it with his own hands over the course of 2 summers, and every beam and joint was a record of his intention, his belief that something permanent was possible here. Alice fed the chickens, checked on the cattle, and stood at the kitchen table for a long time looking at the ring in the last of the afternoon light. The garnet caught it and held it, that deep red glow that had always reminded her of something warm. She set the ring on the windowsill above the kitchen basin, where it caught the last of the sunlight, and she let herself feel the full weight of what she was considering. 3 days later, she went back to Harlan's and accepted the $8. She had spent those 3 days trying every other option she could think of. She had written to Thomas's brother in Kansas City, but James Grayson had made his opinion of her land-keeping ambitions clear when Thomas died, and she had not expected a response and did not receive one. She had asked Pete Dawson's father, who owned the neighboring property, whether he might consider a loan against her summer cattle sales, and Gerald Dawson had been kind about it, but had explained that his own situation was tighter than it looked. She had considered asking at the bank in Abilene, but the Dust Creek grapevine had already told her that the bank was not extending credit to single women without a male cosigner, which was the sort of injustice that sat in her chest like a coal that stayed hot no matter how much time passed. She accepted Harlan's $8 and put them with the $9.30 she had scraped together from every other source available to her, and she sat with $17.30 and stared at the $30 gap between herself and her property, with a feeling that was somewhere between grief and fury. She was still sitting with that feeling when she heard a knock at her door that evening. It was Gerald Dawson's boy Pete, 14 and serious, with his father's note in hand. The note said that a cattle buyer had come through Dust Creek that afternoon, a man named Calloway who was buying quality stock at fair prices, and that if Alice had any cattle to sell, she might want to ride in tomorrow before he moved on. She read the note twice, then read it again. Selling 2 of her cattle at a fair price might close the gap. She would have 6 head left, which was not comfortable but was workable. She thanked Pete, gave him a corn biscuit from the cooling rack, and went to bed with a plan for the first time in weeks. She was in Dust Creek before 8 o'clock the following morning. The man named Calloway was at the livery stable, which was where cattle business typically got done in Dust Creek, and she recognized him the moment she saw the back of his gray coat and his weather-battered hat. He was the same man who had held the door for her at Harlan's 3 days ago. He was crouched beside a cow that belonged to Frank Ellison, running his hands along her flanks with the focused attention of a man who was taking the assessment seriously. Alice waited. He finished his inspection, spoke briefly with Frank Ellison, wrote something in a small leather notebook, and then straightened up and turned around and found Alice standing 5 feet away. "Mrs. Grayson," said Frank by way of introduction, gesturing at her. "Widow of Thomas Grayson, good man, had that property down on Marker Creek." The cattle buyer looked at her with those amber-brown eyes and touched his hat. "Robert Calloway," he said. "You've got cattle to sell." "2," she said. "Both healthy, both good weight, both have calved before. Can you bring them in? I can have them here by 10 o'clock. He looked at her for a moment in that level way he had, not appraising her the way some men looked at women alone, but considering her the way someone considers a statement that sounds reasonable and is deciding whether it actually is. 10 o'clock, he agreed. She drove back to the property, cut 2 of her better cows from the small herd, and had them at the livery stable by 5 minutes before 10. Robert Calloway examined them with the same quiet attention he had given Frank Ellison's cattle, running his hands along their backs, checking their teeth, looking at their hooves. He was thorough without being theatrical about it, which she appreciated. $15 for the pair, he said. Alice had hoped for 18. 15 was still better than she had managed to calculate on her own. 16, she said. He looked at her again with that considering expression. 15.50, he said. Done, she said, because 15.50 and her 17.30 meant she had $32.80, and she needed 47, and she was still $14.20 short, but it was closer than she had been, and she was too tired to negotiate further without knowing if her voice would hold steady. He counted out the money from a worn leather wallet, exact and unhurried. She folded the bills carefully and put them in the pocket of her apron. "You're the widow on Marker Creek," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I am? Good land down there," he said. "Creek stays clear most of the year." "Yes," she said, a little surprised. "Springs fed even in the dry months." He nodded slowly, looking at some middle distance that wasn't the livery stable wall. "That's worth holding on to," he said, and it sounded like something a person says when they mean it rather than when they're filling silence. She thanked him and left. She was not thinking about Robert Calloway in any particular way as she walked back to where Clover was tied. She was thinking about $14.20 and whether there was anything else she could sell that she hadn't already considered selling. The cedar box the ring had lived in was just a cedar box now. The extra saddle hanging in the barn was Thomas's and she hadn't touched it, but it might fetch something. The good wool blanket her mother had woven might fetch $1 or $2 at Harlan's. She was doing the arithmetic of small losses in her head, and it was absorbing enough that she nearly walked past the post office without noticing the man standing outside it. It was Reg Cutter. Reg Cutter was not a man Alice liked, which was a polite way of saying he was a man she actively dreaded. He owned the largest spread in the county, some 4,000 acres east of Dusk Creek, and had made it large through a combination of genuine industry and a remarkable willingness to acquire neighboring properties when their owners fell into difficulty. He was not crude about it. He made offers. They were never quite fair offers, but they were offers, and he delivered them with a kind of patient persistence that was more unsettling than overt hostility would have been. He had made an offer on the Grayson property twice since Thomas died. She had declined both times. Tipped his hat when he saw her. He was around 50, well-dressed in the way of successful ranchers, with silver at his temples and a smile that stopped just short of his eyes. "Mrs. Grayson," he said, "I heard you were in town, selling cattle." "Good morning, Mr. Cutter," she said, and made to keep walking. "I wonder if you've had a chance to reconsider my offer," he said, falling into step beside her with a casualness that she recognized as practiced. "With the tax situation being what it is." She stopped walking. "How do you know about my tax situation?" He smiled again, that not quite genuine smile. "Small town, Mrs. Grayson, people talk." "I'm simply saying that my offer stands, and it's a fair one. $1,200 for 320 acres on a spring-fed creek is more than the market would say it's worth, strictly speaking. $1,200. It was a significant sum. It would have set her up somewhere else, maybe in a proper town, maybe in a situation that didn't require her to count every nail and every biscuit. It was not what the land was worth to her, which was incalculable, but that was not how Reg Cutter measured things. "No, thank you," she said. "The offer won't stay open indefinitely," he said pleasantly. "I understand that," she said. "Good day, Mr. Cutter." She walked away with her back straight and her jaw set, and the $14 gap sitting in her chest like a stone. Robert Calloway was still at the livery stable when she passed it again, now in conversation with the livery owner, a quiet man named Drum who mostly communicated in nods and gestures. She didn't stop. She collected Clover, headed home, and spent the remainder of the day in the kind of domestic fury that produces results. She scrubbed the kitchen floor, mended 2 shirts, and calculated her remaining options with the focused grimness of a woman who had decided that whatever happened next would not be because she hadn't tried hard enough. She brought the extra saddle to Harlan's the next morning. He gave her $6 for it, which was less than she knew it was worth but more than she could argue given that it was a buyer's market, and she was the one who had to have the money before May. $6 and $32.80 made $38.80, still $8.20 short. She stood outside Harlan's in the May morning light and looked up at the sky, which was blue and cloudless and entirely indifferent to her situation, and she thought about what else she could sell, and came up against the wall where the answer became nothing, or not nothing, but nothing she could part with without losing something that couldn't be recovered. The wool blanket her mother had woven would fetch maybe $2. That left $6.20 to find by the end of the month. She was standing there, working through this arithmetic in her head, when a voice behind her said, "Mrs. Grayson." She turned. Robert Calloway was standing with his horse, a good-looking bay gelding with a white blaze, at the water trough beside the general store. He had a paper-wrapped parcel tucked under his arm that suggested he had been in Harlan's moments before she came out. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "I don't mean to intrude," he said, "but I couldn't help overhearing you and Cutter yesterday." She felt a small flash of irritation, not quite at him, but at the idea of her private conversation being overhead, at the fact that nothing in Dusk Creek was ever actually private. "There's nothing to overhear," she said. "He made an offer. I declined it. That's a very short conversation." "I know," he said. He had a way of speaking that was unhurried without being slow, each word chosen with enough care that she found herself actually listening. "I know the Marker Creek land. I came through it 4 years ago before your husband built the house. Spring-fed creek, good grass, limestone ridgeline on the north side that breaks the worst of the winter winds." She looked at him. "You remembered our property from passing through 4 years ago." "I remember good land," he said, without any particular boasting in it. "I was thinking about settling then, didn't in the end." He paused. "I was sorry to hear about your husband." There was a sincerity in it that caught her slightly off guard. Most people said they were sorry, and what they meant was the polite, ritual sorry, the one that lived in the same box as sympathy cards and appropriate intervals of quiet. Robert Calloway said it like he meant the actual content of the words. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then looked at his horse, then back at her. There was something working in him that she couldn't quite read. "Can I ask you something directly?" "You can try," she said. "How short are you?" he asked. "For the taxes." The directness of it startled her, and her first instinct was to say that it was none of his business, and her second instinct, half a second later, was that he had asked it in the tone of someone who had a reason to ask beyond simple curiosity. She decided in that half-second that she was too tired for pride to be worth what it usually cost her. $8.20, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll buy the ring." She stared at him. "What ring?" "The one you sold to Harlan Briggs 3 days ago," he said. "I bought it from him yesterday afternoon." The world went very slightly sideways for a moment. She thought of the ring sitting in Harlan's glass case, thought of Harlan's $8 in her apron pocket, thought of this man standing in a general store 3 days ago when she had been there, and whether he had seen it or known about it, or whether this was a coincidence that was too large to be a coincidence. "Why did you buy it?" she said. He reached into his coat and brought out the ring. It sat in his palm, the garnet catching the morning light with that deep wine-red glow, the gold band simple and clean, her mother's ring, right there in this stranger's hand. "I didn't know it was yours when I bought it," he said quietly. "I heard Harlan talking to someone after you left, saying what it was and who'd brought it in. I was already at the counter." He paused. "I bought it because it seemed wrong for it to sit in a display case." She felt something move in her chest that was complicated and not entirely comfortable. "And now you want to sell it back to me." "I want to give you $12 for it," he said. which is a fair price for a solid gold garnet ring, and which will, if my arithmetic is right, cover your shortfall with a little left over." She looked at the ring in his palm, then at him. He was watching her with an expression that was careful and direct at once, the expression of someone who understands they are doing something that might be taken several different ways and has decided to simply be honest about the intention. "That's not a sale," she said. "That's giving me money and giving me my ring back." "Yes," he said, "it is. I don't take charity, Mr. Calloway." "I know," he said. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a fair price for work I need done." She crossed her arms. "What work?" "I'm wintering 112 head of cattle," he said. "I drive them up from the Pecos, been doing it for 3 years. The pastures I've been renting on the north side of the county won't be available this year. The owner sold to Cutter." He said Cutter's name with a flatness that communicated his opinion of Cutter without elaborating. "I need winter pasture and I need a reliable water source. Your 320 acres and that spring-fed creek would be exactly what I need from October to March." She uncrossed her arms slightly. "You want to lease the winter grazing rights?" "For 6 months. I'll pay $12 for the lease agreement plus the ring. It's a fair price for winter grazing on land that size, maybe slightly above fair given the water, and I'll pay it up front before you go to the county assessor." She thought about this. She thought about it carefully, because she had learned to be careful, and because $12 up front was real money, and a winter lease on the grazing rights was a real arrangement that would benefit both of them, and because the alternative was that she went to the county assessor $8 short and lost the land that Thomas had built and her mother had blessed, and that she had been holding together with stubbornness and biscuit money for 14 months. "You'll have to move them off by the 1st of April at the latest," she said. "I start my spring planting in the east field and the cattle will need to be clear of the creek pasture." "1st of April," he agreed immediately, as if he'd already known that would be the condition. "And I'll need it in writing," she said. "I have paper in my saddlebag," he said. She almost laughed at that. The almost laugh surprised her because she hadn't been close to laughing in quite some time. They drafted the agreement on the back of a wanted notice that was the only paper he had, which said something about the quality of paperwork in Dust Creek in the year 1882, and she signed it Alice E. Grayson in the careful hand that her mother had insisted upon, and he signed it R.T. Calloway in a hand that was clear and spare, like the way he spoke. He counted out $12 from that worn leather wallet. She took it, added it to the $38.80 in her apron pocket, and for the first time in 3 weeks had more than $47 in her possession. She had exactly $50.80, which was 47.80 cents more than the county assessor required, and the $3.80 felt like the first real margin she had breathed inside in a very long time. She looked at the ring in her hand. He had already turned back to his horse, adjusting the saddle strap with the unhurried attention he gave to everything. "Mr. Calloway," she said. He turned. She didn't know quite what she wanted to say. "Thank you" seemed inadequate and also awkward given the formal nature of the arrangement they had just made, and everything else she thought of was either too much or too little. "The creek runs clearest in early morning," she said, "before the cattle stir it up. In case you want to know that for when your herd arrives." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite classify. Then he nodded. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. She rode to the county assessor's office in Abilene the following morning and paid $47 in full, received her receipt, and rode home with the receipt folded in the cedar box and the ring back on the mantel where it belonged, the garnet catching the afternoon light through the kitchen window. She allowed herself one long breath of relief. Then she went and fed the chickens. Robert Calloway came back to Dust Creek in early June, not with cattle, those wouldn't arrive until October, but to attend to what he called a few other pieces of business, which apparently included buying lumber and talking to Drum at the livery, and eating at the town's one small restaurant twice that she noticed. She saw him on her trips into town for supplies, and they exchanged the kind of nods and brief greetings that people exchange when they have a business arrangement, and are both too occupied to elaborate on it. Except that one afternoon she saw him helping Martha Elridge, who was 73 and had buried 2 husbands, load a heavy flour sack into her wagon, and he did it with the same uncomplicated attentiveness he brought to everything. And Martha Elridge called him a good boy in the way that 73-year-olds call 30-year-olds boys, and he smiled at that, a real smile. And Alice found herself watching from 2 stores down, and then catching herself watching and looking away. He was maybe 29 or 30, she thought, somewhere in that range. He had a quality that some men who had worked outside all their lives developed, which was that their age became difficult to read, worn into the same weathered steadiness as the landscape they moved through. She was not thinking about him as a person of interest. She had a business arrangement with him, and she had a property to manage, and the idea of interest felt distant and slightly foreign, like a language she had been fluent in once and had let go unpracticed for 14 months. Summer came on full and heavy, the way Texas summers did, with a heat that crouched over the land from sunrise and didn't lift until well after dark. Alice worked. She worked with a consistency that Pete Dawson, now helping her more regularly, could not quite keep up with, not from laziness but from the simple fact that she was driven by something that had moved past ordinary determination into something closer to personal refusal. She was refusing, every day, the version of things where she lost. The fence line along the north pasture was repaired section by section. The smokehouse roof, which had developed a worrying sag, was re-shingled with lumber she bought from the Abilene yard and hauled herself. She planted beans and squash and corn in the east field and irrigated from the creek with the same hand-dug channel Thomas had started and she had extended. She was decent with the rifle, better than decent, and she kept the fox population around the chicken house honest. She was not, she had decided, going to be a woman who waited for things to happen to her. That had been a lesson that came with grief, this particular kind of sharpened self-reliance, and she had learned it thoroughly. In July, she got a letter from Thomas's brother James in Kansas City. It was 2 pages long and written in a tone that oscillated between condescension and concern, which was James Grayson's characteristic range, and the substance of it was that he had heard she was struggling, that he felt she was being unreasonably stubborn about the land, and that he would be happy to help her resettle in Kansas City where she could find respectable employment and wouldn't have to live alone on the frontier. He enclosed $5 as a gesture of goodwill. Alice kept the $5 and wrote back a letter that was 2 paragraphs long, thanked him for the money, told him the property was not for sale and that she was managing fine, and wished him and his wife well. She sent it on the next stage. She was not managing fine in the sense that everything was comfortable. She was managing fine in the sense that she had not been defeated, which was the only definition that mattered to her at the moment. In August, Robert Calloway came by the property. She saw the bay gelding from a distance before she saw the rider, coming up the track from the main road with the unhurried ease of a horse and rider who understood each other well. She was in the garden at the time, pulling squash, and she straightened up and shaded her eyes. He pulled up at the fence gate and dismounted with the natural ease of a man who has spent more of his life on horseback than off it. "Mrs. Grayson," he said, "Mr. Calloway." She pulled off her garden gloves and walked over. "Is something wrong with the arrangement?" "No," he said. "I was in the area, wanted to see the pasture before I brought the herd." "Of course," she said. "Go on ahead." He nodded and then he didn't move. "I also wanted to ask if you'd had any more trouble with Cutter." She considered this. "Why would you ask that?" "Because I've heard he bought up 3 more properties in the last 2 months," he said. 2 of them were neighbors of yours, the Carlin place and the Thompson spread. She had heard this too, and it had sat uneasily with her. The Carlins had left last spring, Frank Carlin following a mining opportunity north, and the Thompsons had been struggling since old Warren Thompson's back gave out. Their properties bordering her east and west sides respectively was something she had not fully considered. Cutter owning both of them changed the geometry of her situation in ways she was still thinking through. "He hasn't approached me again," she said. "Not directly." "He will," Robert said, with the same flat certainty he'd used saying Cutter's name back in May. She looked at him. There was something in his face she couldn't quite read, a combination of the practical and the personal that she was not sure she understood the shape of. "You seem to know a fair amount about Reg Cutter," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the pasture beyond the fence. "I know the type," he said carefully. "Men who expand by waiting for people to get desperate enough. I've been in enough parts of the territory to know how it usually goes." He paused. "It usually goes badly for the person who's being waited on." "I'm aware of that," she said. He looked back at her. "I know you are," he said. "I'm not trying to tell you how things work. I wanted to make sure someone was paying attention." It was a peculiar thing to say, and she turned it over in her mind for a moment, the particular gentleness of it, the way it was phrased not as a warning or an intrusion but as something closer to company. "Would you like some water?" she asked. "Or coffee, if you can wait 10 minutes for the fire?" "Coffee," he said, with a speed that suggested he had been hoping to be asked. She made coffee on the kitchen stove while he walked the fence line of the south pasture and looked at the creek. And when he came back, she had 2 cups on the kitchen table and a plate of the cornbread she'd baked that morning. And they sat across from each other in the kitchen that still had Thomas's mended chair at one end and the cedar box on the mantel and the garnet ring catching the afternoon light. And they talked. They talked about the land first, the practical things, where the best grazing was and where the creek ran widest and where the ground got soft after heavy rain. Then they talked about the cattle business, which he had been in for 7 years, starting as a ranch hand in New Mexico territory and working his way to the point where he ran his own drives with his own stock. He was clear about the fact that he wasn't a wealthy man, but he was a solvent one, with careful habits and the kind of straightforward accounting that came from knowing what failure looked like up close. He had grown up in Missouri, he said, the middle of 5 brothers, on a small farm that had been ground up by the war and had never quite recovered. He had come west at 18 because the alternatives were poverty in place or poverty in motion, and he had chosen motion. She told him about growing up in Central Texas, her father's small cattle operation, the way the land had looked to her as a child, enormous and promising. She told him about meeting Thomas at a church social in Abilene when she was 19 and he was 22, about the 2 years of courtship that had been conducted largely through letters because Thomas had been working a drive north and her father had not initially been certain about the match. She told him about the first winter in the house, which had been the most difficult and in many ways the most interesting, when every problem was new and every solution was a discovery. She had not talked this much, or this openly, to anyone in a very long time. The isolation of the property, combined with the isolating nature of widowhood, the way people were never quite sure what to say, so they frequently said nothing, had narrowed her conversational world down to Pete Dawson's cheerful one-liners and Gerald Dawson's well-meaning, but brief neighborly visits and Harlan Briggs's commercial interactions. Robert Calloway listened the way people listened when they were actually interested, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually taking in what she was saying, occasionally asking a question that showed he had been following closely. When he finally looked at the angle of the light through the kitchen window and said he should probably get back to town, it had been 2 hours, and Alice found herself sitting with the slightly startled feeling of someone who has forgotten to be lonely. "I'll be back in October," he said at the door, with the hat in his hand. "With the herd. I'll have the south pasture gate open," she said. He put the hat back on, nodded, and walked to his horse, and she watched him from the doorway as he rode back down the track toward the main road, the bay gelding moving in that easy, unhurried way, until the cottonwoods at the edge of the property swallowed them both. She went back inside and washed the coffee cups and thought about nothing in particular very intently. September passed and she worked and the garden came in well, and she sold enough at the Saturday market in Dust Creek to put another $18 by. Reg Cutter appeared at the Saturday market twice, both times finding his way to where she was and making conversation that circled the subject of her property, the way a hawk circles something it's decided it wants but isn't quite ready to drop on. She was polite and firm, both times, and she drove home after each encounter with the familiar coal-hot feeling of injustice sitting in her chest, which was the feeling of being a woman in 1882 Texas who owned something that a powerful man had decided he wanted. She thought about Robert Calloway's words, the ones about Cutter's type, the men who waited for desperation, and she thought about the fact that her situation, while better than it had been in May, was not bulletproof, and that the cattle lease agreement in her cedar box and the good spring in the south pasture and the mended fence line were all real things, but were also things that a sufficiently determined opponent could work around if the circumstances went badly enough. She was not going to let the circumstances go badly. That was the decision she made, repeatedly, through September and into the first cool days of October, the decision that arrived each morning when she got up and looked at the land and felt the full weight of what she had to protect. The herd arrived on the 14th of October, which was the sort of autumn day that Texas does when it is being generous, cool and bright with a sky the color of a river running clear. Robert Calloway drove them up the track from the South Road with two hired hands, a lean older man named Bill who communicated mostly through the movement of his eyebrows, and a younger man named Collins who was cheerful in the undisguised way of people who are genuinely enjoying their work. 112 cattle moving through a gate was a sound, and a sight that Alice found unexpectedly satisfying, the particular kind of purposeful noise that meant the land was being used, that the investment she had made in fence repairs and cleared pasture was paying something back in the simple form of animals on the grass that the grass had been waiting to feed. Robert directed the herd with the economical expertise of someone who had done this many times, and when the gate was closed behind the last heifer and the dust was settling in the late afternoon light, he came and stood at the fence beside Alice, and they both looked at the cattle spreading out across the south pasture with the unhurried confidence of creatures who have found what they needed. "Good pasture," he said. "Good cattle," she said. He looked at her. She looked at the pasture. There was a warmth in the air between them that had nothing to do with the October sun, and she noticed it the same way she would notice a change in the quality of the light, something different, something shifted, and she filed it away in the part of herself that was still learning what things meant. Bill and Collins camped at the edge of the property in a tent they'd brought, as had been arranged, to manage the herd's needs through the first week of settling. Robert had his own bedroll, and by mutual unspoken agreement, he used the empty stall at the far end of the small barn, which was warmer than the tent, and not an imposition she minded. Over the following weeks, she found herself keeping track of the small markers of his presence in the way that solitary people track these things. The lantern light in the barn going out around 9 in the evening, the sound of him with his horse in the early morning, the soft voices that men use with the animals they know well. The coffee cup she started leaving out on the kitchen step each morning, which she told herself was a practical courtesy for a man who was managing her winter grazing, and which he accepted without comment, except that the cup was always rinsed and replaced before she came downstairs. He ate supper at her table twice a week, which had begun as a formal arrangement and softened into something more comfortable. They talked the way people talk when they have discovered that they are genuinely interested in each other's thoughts, following threads from topic to topic without worrying too much about where they ended up. He read, which she hadn't expected, and had a worn copy of a book called The Personal Memoirs of General Sherman tucked into his saddlebag that he was working through with the focused patience he brought to everything. She had a small shelf of books above the mantel, a Bible and a geology of Texas and 2 novels and a book of poetry that had been her mother's, and he looked at it with the obvious pleasure of someone who doesn't often get to be near books. She gave him the poetry book one evening when he admired it, pushing it across the table. "I'd like to borrow it," he said, looking at it. "It's yours," she said. He looked up at her. "I can't take your mother's book." "My mother would have liked you," she said, with a certainty that arrived fully formed and that she couldn't quite account for but didn't want to walk back. She had a low tolerance for people who were false and a high tolerance for people who were direct. He held the book in both hands for a moment. "I'll take good care of it," he said finally. "I know you will," she said. November came in cold and the cattle settled into their winter patterns, and Bill and Collins moved on to other work after the first month, leaving Robert alone with the herd management, which he handled without apparent difficulty. He was up before dawn every morning, and she would sometimes hear him from her sleeping loft, the particular quiet sounds of a capable person beginning their work in the dark, and the sounds were oddly companionable, the way sounds are when you've been alone long enough to value any reminder that the world contains other people. Reg Cutter came by on a Wednesday in the third week of November. He rode up in the mid-morning alone, which was slightly unusual because Cutter generally had at least one of his men with him, as a kind of ambient demonstration of his resources. Today he came alone, which she thought was calculated, meant to look friendlier. She was at the fence checking a post when she heard the horse, and she straightened up and waited. He dismounted with the ease of a good horseman and stood at the property gate with his hat in his hand, which was a gesture of courtesy that she did not entirely trust. "Mrs. Grayson," he said, "I heard you had a cattleman wintering stock here." "That's correct," she said. "A legitimate lease arrangement." "I'm sure it is," he said, in a tone that managed to be both agreeable and slightly doubtful. "I come today with an updated offer, $1,500. She looked at him. $1,500 was $300 more than his last offer. "And why," she said, "would you increase the offer by $300? He smiled the smile she didn't trust. "Because I'm serious about acquiring this particular piece of land, and I want to demonstrate that seriousness." "The land is not for sale," she said. "Mrs. Grayson." His voice shifted slightly, dropped a half register toward something more patient and more patronizing. "You're a capable woman, I think everyone in this county would say that, but you're alone out here. The winters are not getting easier. The tax burden doesn't go away. And the surrounding properties are all under my management now, which means that if there's ever a problem with access or with water rights on the shared fence lines, you might find yourself in a complicated legal situation." She felt the cold come into her clearly and completely. This was different from the earlier offers. This was not charm and persistence. This was the edge of a threat, dressed up in the language of practical observation. "Mr. Cutter," she said, in a voice that was level because she worked to make it level, "are you telling me that you intend to create problems with the water rights or the fence lines?" "I'm telling you that these things become complicated when properties don't have clear cooperative relationships," he said. "That's just the nature of land ownership." "I'd like you to leave now," she said. His eyes went flat for a moment, the smile staying in place while everything behind it stopped. Then he put his hat back on. "My offer is open for another 30 days, he said. "After that I'll have to look elsewhere." He rode away, and she stood at the fence until he was out of sight, and then she walked to the barn because her hands were shaking slightly, and she wanted to be somewhere enclosed. Robert was in the barn, as it happened, repairing a piece of tack with a needle and heavy thread, sitting on an upturned bucket with the focused attention he brought to any task that needed it. He looked up when she came in. He saw her face. He set the tack down. "What happened?" he said. She told him. She laid it out plainly, what Cutter had said and how he had said it, not dramatizing it but also not minimizing it, because it needed to be understood clearly. Robert listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a long moment, his jaw set in a way that was the only visible sign of what the information was doing to him. "Water rights," he said finally. "Does he have any legitimate claim to the creek on his side of the line?" "The creek originates on my property," she said. It runs north across the Carlin property, which is now Cutter's, but the spring is on my land. I had a survey done when Thomas filed the original claim. You have the survey documents. In the cedar box with the tax receipt. He nodded slowly. Then any legal action he tries on the water would be expensive for him and unlikely to succeed, he said. That doesn't mean he won't try it to create difficulty, but it means you have a solid position to defend from. I know that, she said. I'm not worried about the law. I'm worried about the space between the law and what he's actually willing to do. He looked at her with those amber-brown eyes. Yes, he said, that's the right thing to be worried about. They stood in the barn in the November cold with the cattle sounds drifting in from the pasture and the smell of hay and leather and the particular quiet of a space where two people are thinking hard about the same problem. I could stay on through the spring, he said, past the 1st of April, if that would help. She looked at him. That's not in the arrangement. The arrangement can be changed, he said. I have work through January and then I have a drive planned for April, but between January and April there's time that I don't have fixed plans for. I could winter here and be another set of eyes and hands. Not for free, he added quickly, in a tone that told her he'd anticipated her next objection. I'll bring on another 15 head and lease the extension of the east pasture through April. She thought about this. Having another person on the property through the winter, through the uncertain period while Cutter was making up his mind about what his next move was not a small thing. You'd be sleeping in the barn through February, she said. I've slept in worse places, he said. The cold gets significant, she said. I'm from Missouri, he said. I know what cold is. She almost smiled again. That almost smile was becoming a habit when he said things she had noticed. All right, she said. Extended through the 1st of April, same lease terms proportional to the additional acreage. Agreed, he said. December came and the land went into the particular hush of winter, the grass tawny and still, the creek running clear and cold between its banks, the sky at night so full of stars that it looked like a demonstration of excess. Alice fell into the rhythms of the winter property. The routine of early mornings and constant small tasks and the long, quiet evenings by the kitchen fire. And Robert Calloway fell into those rhythms alongside her with a naturalness that she found, at various points throughout December, alternately comfortable and slightly unsettling. He was easy company. That was the thing she kept coming back to, not in any overwrought sense, but simply the fact that his presence was easy in the way that the presence of very few people was easy. He didn't require management or performance. He was capable of sitting in the same room in silence without making the silence awkward. He did his share of work and then some, without being asked and without making a point of it. He told her things she didn't know about cattle management, and the way weather moved across the Texas plains and the particular economics of the cattle drive business, with the directness of someone who assumes the other person is intelligent enough to find the information useful. And he asked her things. He was consistently, genuinely curious about her, about how she thought and what she knew, and what she had decided about the various questions that living alone on a piece of land forces a person to decide. He treated her opinions on water rights and fence line management and soil quality and the politics of county government with the same attentiveness he gave his own, which was something she had experienced from Thomas and from her father and from very few other people, and the experience of it was something she had not realized she had been missing until it was present again. On Christmas Day she cooked a proper roast, and he brought out a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving, and they sat at the kitchen table after dinner in the firelight with the whiskey in two of her good glasses, and the cedar box open on the mantel, because she had gotten out her mother's ring to look at it, which was something she sometimes did at Christmas, and the garnet caught the firelight and glowed with that deep, warm red, and she told him about her mother. About a leaner Grayson, née Porter, who had come to Texas as a girl and spent her whole life here and had died of pneumonia when Alice was 17, and how the ring had always been the most vivid physical memory of her. This small circle of gold and red light. He listened with his whiskey glass held in both hands and his eyes on her face, and he said, "She sounds like someone you're glad to have come from." "Yes," Alice said simply, "that's exactly it." There was a pause that was warm rather than uncomfortable, the pause of two people who have found they can exist in the same quiet without it being empty. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can always ask me something," he said. "Why have you never settled?" she asked. 7 years of cattle drives and you're still moving. You said you were thinking about settling when you came through here 4 years ago. What changed?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "Nothing changed," he said. "I talked myself out of it, the way you do when you're not sure if you're staying because of the right reasons or because you're tired of moving. And now," he looked at her, and there was something in the look that was direct, the way a great many things about him were direct, not aggressive, not presumptuous, but clear. "Now I think I understand better what the right reasons look like," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked at her own glass. The firelight moved between them, warm and steady. She did not say anything else about it that night, and neither did he, and they finished the whiskey and said good night with the restrained propriety of two people who are aware of something that hasn't yet found its shape. And she went up to her sleeping loft, and he went to the barn, and she lay awake for a while in the January cold, listening to the wind against the cedar boards and thinking about things she hadn't thought about in a long time. January passed. The cold was significant, as she had warned him, and the wood supply went faster than expected, and they spent 2 full days in mid-January cutting and splitting timber from the stand of post oak on the North Ridge, working side by side, with an efficiency born of having figured out over 2 months how the other person moved and thought and worked. He was a better axeman than she was, which was simply a matter of weight and leverage, and she was a better hand at the crosscut saw, which she had spent 2 years learning to do well, and they fell into a rhythm that covered the distance in good time. On the second afternoon of cutting, when they were loading the split wood into the wagon and the sweat had frozen at her hairline and her arms were tired in the good way of actual physical work, he said, with his back to her and a log in both hands, "I'd like to say something." "Then say it," she said. He set the log in the wagon and turned around, and she could see that he had been working up to this in his methodical way, that he had organized the thought before presenting it, which was entirely characteristic. "I know I'm a man who drives cattle and lives out of a saddlebag," he said, "and I know that doesn't look like stability, and I know you've had enough of losing things that were supposed to be permanent. I'm not going to pretend those things aren't true." She stood with a log in her arms and looked at him. "I'm also not going to pretend," he said, "that what I feel when I'm here in this place with you is something I'm unfamiliar with. I know what it is. I've known what it was since about the 3rd week of October, and I've been figuring out whether I had the right to say anything. And I've decided that the only honest thing to do is say it and let you decide." She set her log in the wagon. "I'd like to stop driving cattle," he said, "or most of it. I have enough saved that I could buy a reasonable piece of land. Not this land, your land. I'm not asking for anything that's yours, but something nearby, something I could build on. I'd like to build something, and I would like to do it near you if that is something that you—" He stopped. This was the most words she had ever heard him say in sequence, and the strain of it, the effort of saying the actual thing rather than the careful adjacent thing, was visible in him and was one of the most honest things she had seen in a long time. "Robert," she said. He stopped. "Come here," she said. He came, 2 steps across the frosted ground, and she looked up at him in the pale January light with the timber smell around them and the horses standing patient at the front of the wagon, and she reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, which was cold from the winter air and rough with the beard that grew in dark and went silver at the jaw line, and he went very still. "I have not been ready," she said. "For a long time I was not ready. And then I stopped knowing whether I wasn't ready or whether I was just afraid of the distance between not ready and ready. Yes, he said, barely above a murmur. "I'm not afraid of that distance anymore," she said. "I don't know what I am exactly, but I'm not afraid." He covered her hand with his there on his cold jaw, his large, warm hand over hers. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." She stretched up and kissed him, softly, in the winter afternoon on the north ridge among the post oaks with the wood chips around their feet and the frozen sky above them. And he kissed her back with the same quality he brought to everything, completely present, entirely in the moment, as if there was nowhere else in the world he would rather be. When they separated, he was looking at her with those amber-brown eyes that had not, she realized, been difficult to read for quite some time. What was in them was clear and bright and unguarded, and she felt it open something in her that had been closed for 14 months, something she had not been sure was still there to open. "We should get the wood loaded before dark," she said, a little breathlessly. "Yes," he said and smiled, and the smile was the most uncomplicated thing she had seen on a human face in recent memory, and she turned back to the wood pile with warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the physical labor. They drove back to the property in the long blue winter dusk with the wood loaded high in the wagon, and she could feel him beside her on the wagon bench, the warmth of his arm against her shoulder through 2 layers of coat, and it felt the way things feel when they are exactly where they are supposed to be. February brought a week of heavy weather, cold rain and then ice, the kind of Texas ice storm that catches the plains by surprise and makes the cattle miserable and the fence lines treacherous. They worked through it together, breaking ice in the water troughs every morning and reinforcing the worst of the fence sections, and bringing 2 of the youngest heifers into the barn linta when the temperature dropped past the point of outdoor safety. There were evenings during that week when the ice was too heavy and the dark came too fast, and there was nothing to do but come inside and be warm, and those evenings had a quality she hadn't had since Thomas, which was the quality of being known and comfortable and safe in another person's presence. They played cards, badly on her part and precisely on his. They read aloud to each other from the books on her shelf. He read her passages from the Sherman memoirs, which were not at all romantic but which he found genuinely fascinating, and she found interesting despite herself. She read him poems from her mother's book, and he listened to them with the kind of attention that poetry needs, which is the attention of someone willing to let something unfamiliar land. On the 4th night of the ice storm, when the wind was pressing against the windows and the fire was the center of the world, he told her about the war, which had been the defining event of his Missouri childhood. He had been a young boy, 9 when it started, and the farm had been in the path of 2 different armies at 2 different moments, and the things he had seen at 9 and 11 years old had given him, he said, a very clear understanding of what mattered and what didn't. It had taken him some years after that to learn how to apply that understanding to his own life rather than just to the abstract world. She told him about the hard year after Thomas died, the particular geography of grief, the way it moved and changed, and the way she had sometimes not recognized it as grief but as simple inability to function, and how the land had saved her, in a practical way, because the land required her to function regardless. They talked until the fire burned low and they were both tired, and then he kissed her good night at the kitchen door, her hand in both of his, and went out into the ice and to the barn, and she went upstairs and slept better than she had slept in months. Reg Cutter made his second threatening move in early March, and it was more concrete than the November conversation. He had his lawyer file a notice with the county claiming disputed ownership of the stretch of fence line between his newly acquired Carlin property and the Grayson East boundary, citing an alleged survey discrepancy. It was not a strong legal claim. She knew that from the survey documents, but it was a real document filed with real county officials, and it required her to respond, which meant engaging a lawyer in Abilene, which meant money. She came home from Abilene with the lawyer's first consultation fee paid and a slight headache behind her eyes, and Robert was waiting at the kitchen table with coffee already made, because he had known she was going to Abilene for this and had clearly assessed that she would need coffee when she returned. "What's the verdict?" he asked. "My position is solid," she said, sitting down across from him. "The survey is clear. His claim is based on an old deed description that predates the proper survey by 15 years. The lawyer says it should be dismissed, but that it'll take 2 or 3 months to work through the process." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "It's a harassment strategy. It's meant to cost me time and money and worry." Robert's jaw was set in that way. "It's cowardly," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. Then he said carefully, "I want to talk to you about something." She looked at him. "I found a piece of land," he said. 200 acres, 3 miles north of here on the other side of the Dawson property. Good grass, reliable, solid farmhouse that needs some work but nothing unreasonable. The asking price is $800. She absorbed this. "You're planning to buy it." "I have the money," he said. "I've been liquid for 2 years, waiting for the right piece. This is the right piece." He paused. "I want to be near you, Alice. Not on your land, not in your house, not in any way that makes any claim on what's yours. Just near. As a neighbor. And as something more than a neighbor, if that's where we're going, which I believe it is." She looked at him across the table in the March morning kitchen, with the coffee steaming between them and the sound of the cattle from the south pasture drifting through the slightly open window. "That's where we're going," she said. He nodded once with the particular gravity of a man who had been carrying the weight of an unresolved question and has just had it answered. "Then I'm going to buy the Haver land," he said, "and I'm going to make it into something worth having." "You already have something worth having," she said. He looked at her, that clear, unguarded look. "Yes," he said, "I know." He made the offer on the Haver property the following week, and it was accepted. He moved his remaining cattle to the new land on the 1st of April, as agreed, and she stood at her south gate and watched the herd move north up the road with Robert at its head on the bay gelding, and she felt many things simultaneously. The particular satisfaction of an arrangement completed, the mild strangeness of a quiet that the cattle had filled, and something that was not emptiness but was more like the feeling before a beginning, a space where something is about to arrive. He came back in the evening, without the cattle, on the bay gelding alone, and knocked on her kitchen door and asked if he could take her to dinner at the restaurant in Dusk Creek. "You're asking me to dinner," she said. "Yes," he said. "You've eaten at my table approximately 40 times in the last 6 months," she said. "That was different," he said. "This is dinner." She went upstairs and changed into the dark green dress she hadn't worn since the Dusk Creek Harvest social 2 years ago, and pinned her hair up with the 2 tortoiseshell combs her mother had given her, and came downstairs to find him standing in the kitchen with his hat in his hands, and an expression that told her clearly that the green dress was working as intended. They had dinner at the restaurant, which was called Mabel's and was run by Mabel Sutton, who was 52, and had the eyes of someone who had seen everything and judged nothing out of long professional habit. Mabel brought them pot roast and biscuits and peach pie, and looked between them with an expression that contained both approval and the particular satisfaction of a woman who sees 2 people being happy and considers it a net positive for the establishment. After dinner, they walked along the main street in the cool spring evening, and he took her hand when they turned away from the lit windows and onto the quieter stretch near the livery, and she let him keep it, his warm hand around hers, walking in the dark with the stars laid out above Dusk Creek in all their extraordinary extravagance. "I want to ask you something properly," he said. She already knew what he was going to say in the way that a song is going to resolve to its home note, and her heart moved upward in her chest. "Robert," she said. "Let me say it properly," he said. "I've been practicing." She stopped walking. He stopped too and turned toward her, still holding her hand. "I'm a man who drives cattle and reads history books and fixes things," he said. "I'm not a wealthy man and I'm not a young man and I have not always made the right decisions, but I know how to stay. I've been looking for a thing worth staying for and I've found it. I've found it in you and in the land you've kept through everything, and in the person you are, which is the most honest and capable and good person I have known. And I would like to spend the rest of my life being near you officially, if you'll have me." She was looking up at him in the starlight, this man with his weathered face and his direct eyes and his careful words, and she felt the love in her chest with a clarity that was entirely different from the young love of her first marriage, not lesser but sharper, built on knowledge rather than promise, and equally true. "Yes," she said, "I'll have you." He kissed her there on the quiet street in Dusk Creek, and Mabel Sutton happened to be looking out the window of her restaurant, and later told 3 people about it with the satisfied gravity of someone reporting a satisfying conclusion. They were married in June of 1883 in the Dusk Creek Church, with Gerald Dawson standing up as witness and his wife Clara crying in a pleasant way in the front pew. Pete Dawson was 14 and solemn, and wore his best shirt. Mabel Sutton brought a cake. The preacher, a cheerful man named Abernathy who had been marrying and burying the citizens of Dusk Creek for 20 years, performed the ceremony with the efficiency of long practice and the warmth of genuine goodwill. Alice wore the dark green dress and her mother's ring, the garnet ring, on her right hand, because she had decided to move Thomas's wedding band to the right hand too, and to wear her mother's ring on the left where new promises were made. It felt right in the way that decisions made from an honest place feel right, honoring the past without being imprisoned by it. Robert wore a dark coat he had bought in Abilene and had his hair cut, which changed his appearance enough that Clara Dawson told him he looked distinguished, and he looked slightly alarmed by this, which made Alice quietly, deeply happy. The Cutter legal challenge was dismissed by the county court in July of that year, cleanly and completely. The judge noted that the survey documentation was unambiguous and that the challenge appeared to have been filed without sufficient legal foundation. Alice paid the lawyer's final fee without resentment and filed the dismissal notice in the cedar box alongside the tax receipt and the original lease agreement and all the other small documents that constituted the history of the land. Cutter made no further approaches. Robert's 200 acres 3 miles north, the Haver place as it continued to be called for a while, was not immediately sold. They discussed this carefully, the practical question of what to do with 2 adjacent pieces of property owned by 2 people who were now one household. The decision they arrived at was thoroughly practical and also felt deeply right. They would live on the Grayson property, which was the anchor, the home, the thing that had been preserved through everything and deserved to be the center, and they would work both pieces, running Robert's cattle operation across both properties with the winter grazing on the Grayson South pasture and the summer pasture on the Haver land, using the Haver farmhouse for storage and the well as a secondary water source. It was a good plan and it worked. Robert proved, as she had intuited, to be a man who was genuinely good at staying. He was not dramatic about it, not performative, not the kind of person who made a production of their own dependability. He was simply there, every day, working the land alongside her with the same quiet efficiency he had brought from the beginning. He fixed the barn roof in August and extended the garden in September, and spent the better part of October improving the irrigation channel from the creek, doing it with an engineering care that resulted in a system significantly more reliable than the one Thomas had started, which she noted without sentimentality and with gratitude. She did not stop being herself. That was the other thing she noticed. The way being loved by him did not require her to be smaller or softer or less certain of her own opinions. He liked her opinions. He argued with her when he thought she was wrong, not to defeat her, but because he took her seriously enough to disagree, and she argued back, and they were both right and wrong in their various proportions, and the disagreements ended in solutions that were better than either of them had come to separately. The legal situation with the county, the water rights, the fence lines, the status of the surrounding properties, all of these settled into clarity over the following year. Two of Cutter's acquisitions were challenged by their former owners in separate legal actions that Cutter did not come out of cleanly, and the combination of those challenges and the Grayson fence line dismissal seemed to give him cause to redirect his attentions elsewhere. He was still a significant presence in the county, still the largest landowner, still the man you had to account for in any conversation about property in the region. But he stopped circling the Grayson property, and the cold-hot feeling in Alice's chest gradually cooled to something she could simply be aware of without being consumed by. In the spring of 1884, Alice discovered she was expecting a child. She told Robert on a morning in April when the cottonwoods along the south fence were putting out their new leaves, pale green and trembling in the warm wind. She had been certain for 2 weeks, and had been carrying the knowledge with a combination of joy and a particular private vertigo, the feeling of enormous change approaching on certain feet. He was at the fence when she came out to find him, checking the gate latch that had been giving trouble. He looked up when he heard her step, and she stopped a few feet away, and he must have seen something in her face because he straightened up entirely. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. The expression that moved through his face was something she wanted to remember for the rest of her life. It went through several things in rapid sequence: surprise, understanding, and then something so open and unguarded that it was almost painful to look at directly, the pure, unfiltered version of how much this mattered to him. He covered the distance between them in 2 steps and held her against him with the careful gentleness of someone who is conscious of something precious, and she felt him breathe against her hair, one long, deep breath. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm perfectly well," she said, her voice muffled against his coat. "I'm better than all right." "Okay," he said. "Okay, good." He pulled back to look at her face, holding her by the shoulders. His eyes were bright. "When?" "October, I think, early October." He did the arithmetic quickly, which she had expected, and she saw the faint shadow of it cross his face, the awareness that October was his cattle season, and the immediate decision forming alongside the shadow. "I'll arrange for the drive without me this year," he said. "Collins can handle it." "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to." She put her hand against his jaw. "It's going to be fine," she said. "We're going to be fine." "Yes," he said. "I know, I want to be here." He was here. He arranged for Collins to run the fall drive, which Collins did competently and returned from with good news and a solid profit. And Robert was at the Grayson property through September and October in a state of alert, steady presence that she found both touching and occasionally amusing. He was not anxious in an unhelpful way. He was never unhelpful. But there was an attentiveness in him through those months, a close awareness of her, that was new and entirely characteristic of the particular way he loved people, which was thoroughly and without reservation. The baby arrived on the 8th of October, 1884, delivered by Clara Dawson, who had midwifed half the babies in the county, in the cedar and limestone bedroom that Robert had painted and fitted with a proper cradle in September. It was a boy. He was a solid, clear-eyed boy with his father's brown hair and his mother's jaw, and he came into the world at 4 in the morning with the moon still up and the cattle sounds drifting from the south pasture. And when Robert, who had been kept firmly on the other side of the kitchen door during the significant hours, was finally allowed in, he stood over the cradle for a long time without saying anything, looking at this small person with an expression that Alice, from the bed, could see was one of the most honest things she had ever seen on a human face. He looked up at her. "He's good," he said. "He's very good," she said. They named him Thomas Robert Calloway, Thomas for the man who had built the land and Robert for the man who had helped keep it and would now help grow it. And there was no conflict in the naming, only the honest acknowledgement that both of these men were part of the story of this family and this place. Young Thomas, as he came to be called to distinguish him from the memory, grew up on the property with the particular freedom of ranch children, trailing his father through the pastures and his mother through the garden with equal enthusiasm. By the time he was walking steadily, he had opinions about cattle that were mostly wrong but delivered with great confidence, and opinions about the best place to catch crawfish in the creek that were entirely correct. Pete Dawson, now 16 and growing into a young man of considerable competence, took on a more formal hired hand position at the Callaway operation that year, and he and Robert worked the property through the seasons with the comfortable efficiency of men who had figured out how to work together well. In 1886, Alice had her second child, a girl they named Alice for Alice's mother, born in March with the spring wildflowers already starting on the ridge. Alice was born with red in her hair that neither parent could account for, and a temperament that was sunny in a way that seemed to have bypassed any genetic contribution from either the Grayson or the Callaway line, though Robert said with a straight face that the Callaway side of the family had several documented instances of inexplicable cheer. The property flourished. The word is not too large for what it did. Robert's steady cattle operation combined with Alice's careful land management and the water source that had always been the property's most fundamental advantage meant that the Callaway spread, as it came to be called, was one of the better regarded operations in the county within 3 years. They were not grand in the way of the Cutter operation, not 4,000 acres and a staff of 8, but they were solid and growing and entirely theirs. On a morning in the autumn of 1887, with Thomas running 3 years old and Alice 6 months in the cradle, and the October light laying gold across the south pasture, Alice was in the kitchen making breakfast when she heard Robert come in from the early chores, and she felt the familiar awareness of him in the house, the particular warmth of it, the way the space changed when he was in it, and she stood for a moment at the stove with the pan in her hand and simply felt the fullness of what she had. There had been a morning, 5 years ago, when she had stood in this kitchen and looked at her mother's ring on the windowsill and counted the distance between what she had and what she needed, and the distance had been almost impossibly large. The ring was on her finger now, the garnet warm and red in the morning light as she lifted the coffee pan. The kitchen was the same cedar and limestone room. The cedar box was on the mantel with its accumulation of documents, and among them, the worn and somewhat absurd original lease agreement drafted on the back of a wanted notice. She heard Thomas's feet on the stairs, the particular thunderous approach of a 3-year-old who moves through space as if it has personally challenged him, and then the kitchen was full of small boy and the smell of outdoor air that he carried in with him, and Robert came in behind him with Alice in the crook of his arm, the baby looking at the ceiling with the serene attention that she gave to all ceiling investigation. "Coffee's ready," Alice said. "Good," Robert said. He sat down at the kitchen table with the baby and the 3-year-old arranged around him, and she poured 2 cups and set them on the table and sat across from him, with the morning light coming through the window and the steam rising from the cups. He looked at her over the edge of the cup with those amber-brown eyes. She looked back. There was nothing that needed to be said right at that moment, which was its own kind of abundance. Thomas said something very emphatic about wanting a biscuit, and Alice made a thoughtful sound at the ceiling, and the cattle moved with their gentle morning sound in the pasture, and the creek ran clear and cold in the early light, the spring in the earth that had been there before any of them and would be there long after, faithful and constant, the source of everything. The cedar box on the mantel held its documents, receipts, and agreements, the small paper records of survival and beginning. And in the mornings, when the light hit the kitchen window at the right angle, the garnet in Alice's ring caught it and held it, that deep warm red, her mother's ring, back where it had always belonged, on the hand of a woman who had learned the price of keeping something worth keeping, and had found in the keeping something greater than she had bargained for. Robert set his coffee cup down and reached across the table and took her hand, the one with the ring, his large warm hand over hers, and she turned her palm and held it, and outside the window the cottonwoods that Thomas Grayson had planted along the south fence were tall now, their leaves moving in the morning wind, golden in the autumn light, permanent as promises kept. She had woken each morning for 5 years to the sound of the land being worked, and the sound of her children, and the sound of this man who had appeared in a general store doorway with a hat touched politely, and bought her mother's ring for reasons she had not understood yet, and who had left it on her windowsill one night because he could not in good conscience keep something that belonged to someone else, and who had in doing so, perhaps, understood before she did that the leaving was also the beginning. She had found that note, of course, the morning after Christmas, after the whiskey and the firelight and everything that had been unsaid but understood. She had come downstairs before dawn to start the fire, and there on the kitchen windowsill, exactly where she had set the ring the first evening she brought it home from Harlan's, had been the ring, placed back in the same spot, and beside it a piece of paper that said, in Robert's clear spare handwriting, "Yours." It always was. She had stood in the pre-dawn kitchen with the ring in her palm and the note in her other hand, and she had felt something crack open in her chest that was not grief, and was not fear, and was not the careful armoring she had been wearing for 14 months. It was something that came before everything, before the conversation at the woodpile and the dinner at Mabel's and the proper asking on the dark street. It was the moment she knew. She had put the ring on her finger for the first time since Thomas died. She had gone back upstairs. She had lain in the dark until the sky outside the small window went from black to the deep blue of early morning, and she had felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the future was not a problem to be solved but a thing to be lived. That had been the real beginning. The rest was just the story of what they built from it, which was considerable and solid and very much worth the keeping. Young Thomas grew up to be a rancher, serious and capable like his father, with his mother's quick mind for land and weather and the particular mathematics of survival. He married at 23, a steady young woman from Abilene named Ruth who took to ranch life with the pragmatic enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting to find the right application for her energy. And they built their own house on the Haver land, the old 200 acres 3 miles north, and worked it alongside the main property in a family operation that the county came to know as one of the most solid in the region. Eleanor grew up sunny and particular, with an aptitude for music that surprised them both and a clear-eyed stubbornness about her own choices that Alice recognized without difficulty and Robert found both exasperating and deeply familiar. She was 20 when she decided she wanted to become a teacher, and Alice and Robert sent her to the normal school in Abilene with equal parts pride and the awareness that the world was changing slowly for women, and that Eleanor was the kind of person who walked toward change rather than away from it. Alice and Robert Calloway grew old on the Marker Creek land, the cedar and limestone house holding them through the seasons with the steadiness of well-built things. The property grew and was documented and was passed in proper legal order to their children and to their children's children, the deed chain unbroken from the original Thomas Grayson filing through everything that had come after. In the evenings, in the last light, Robert would sometimes sit on the porch and read, and Alice would sit beside him with the mending or the accounts, or sometimes with nothing at all in her hands, just the evening air and the sound of the creek and the particular late gold light on the cottonwoods, and the garnet ring would catch the last of the sun in its deep red heart, and she would feel the whole length and weight of the years as something not heavy but rich, the way good soil is rich, full of everything that had grown and everything that would grow still. The small cedar box stayed on the mantel. Some of its documents wore out and had to be recopied. The tax receipt from May 1882 was eventually so fragile that she kept it folded inside a piece of oilcloth. The original lease agreement, drafted on the back of a wanted notice for a horse thief named Bell who had been caught 2 weeks after the notice was printed, remained legible through sheer stubbornness, the handwriting of 2 people beginning something neither of them had quite named yet. She never forgot the morning she found the ring on the windowsill. Not the way you remember a dramatic thing, but the way you remember the thing that changed the shape of everything after it, quietly and completely, the way a spring in the earth determines the direction of the water long before the water has any idea where it's going. The land was hers. The land was theirs. The children were grown, and the seasons turned, and the spring ran clear in the south pasture, and the creek kept its ancient, faithful course, and the cottonwood leaves were gold and green in turn, and the story of the Grayson land and the people who loved it well was long and full and entirely, definitively, remarkably good.